cases, these women were independently wealthy, or they were very gifted business women. And so they literally financed their living expenses, their traveling expenses. But they also oftentimes traveled with them in their missionary work, preaching and teaching right alongside the guys. Like Augustine had a lot of women in his home monastery at his cathedral in Hippo.
For watching another episode of the Jude 3 Project podcast. As always, I'm your host, Lisa Fields, the founder of the Jude 3 Project. And today I'm so excited to welcome someone who we've had on the podcast before, Sister Laura Swan. Welcome, Sister Swan.
Thank you. Good to be here. Just call me Sister Laura.
Okay.
Yeah.
Laura. For those who don't know who you are, just give them a little background.
Oh, wow. I'm a Benedictine nun out in the Pacific Northwest. I live in a monastery about an hour south of Seattle. And my passion really has been about the voices that don't normally get included in histories and that are published and stories that we tell, and particularly of women. And the Forgotten Desert Mothers was my very first project of reclaiming the stories that some scholars know but very rarely talk about.
Mm-hmm. And I have the book here, The Forgotten Desert Mothers. So I encourage you all to go get that as a helpful resource. We're going to be talking about this book today, the early church mothers. And I think this is important because a lot of times we talk about the early church, especially in Africa, early African church fathers like Tertullian, Augustine, Athanasius, but we don't necessarily highlight the women in those same spaces. So,
and each of the men you just mentioned had a circle of women who were major supporters of their ministry and had a ministry of their own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. Tell us about how the women in the early Africa and churches supported the men during that time.
In some cases, these women were independently wealthy, or they were very gifted business women. And so they literally financed their living expenses, their traveling expenses. But they also oftentimes traveled with them in their missionary work, preaching and teaching right alongside the guys.
Mm-hmm.
And go ahead.
No, you could go ahead.
Like Augustine had a lot of women in his home monastery at his cathedral in Hippo.
Mm-hmm. And that's helpful because when we think oftentimes about women during that time, we think of women being dependent on men. And really, you're saying that ministry was really kind of held together by the women being a financial resource. And yes, they were savvy business women. Can you talk about some of the savvy business women during that time?
Oh, Paula, Macrina, Marcella. I don't have my list here with me, but these were women who were either inherited wealth or could manage the estates of their families, but they utilized their wealth to establish home churches, monastic communities, to fund missionary endeavors. But they also oftentimes then arranged for others to manage their estates, and they went off and went on their own missionary endeavors on their own. Women tended, as part of their missionary work, to also establish monastic communities, which would be men and women, and usually children being raised alongside, because it created a foundation for cultivating Christian culture and education and healthcare.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk about? I know in chapter 5 you talk about the deaconesses of the church. Can you share a little bit about them for us?
Yeah, deacons, originally the term was gender neutral. Men and women referred to as deacons. And these were the people who were appointed to take in the alms and redistribute to prisons, to widows who were destitute, to orphans, sometimes for the building of churches, but it was really more about building up of people. And women were deacons right alongside of men. They also assisted at baptism, because baptism was usually by full immersion, and usually you were stark naked, and it was not considered appropriate in Christian circles for guys to get in there, at least not without a woman alongside if the women were being baptized. And there's some great stories about, going in and people and oil, and then they lose the grip on the person. And so the stories are also funny, slip and fall into the pool or to wherever they're being baptized. So it was serious, and there was a humorous side to it as well. But it's about 325, 50 that we start seeing deacon and deaconess. It starts becoming gender specific, but the ministry still equals side by side the same.
Now, you start off, you talk about the sayings of the Desert Mothers. One, you talked about Amma Matrona. Can you just share a little bit about her life and Amma Sarah? Because most people know Perpetua and Felicity, and that's kind of the extent of their knowledge of early church women.
Yeah, the great martyrs. Yeah, unfortunately, with our major Ammas, Sarah, Syncletica, Theodora, Matrona, we know they lived in the 300s and probably 300 to 350 or 60, but we actually don't know anything about their life. It's only their sayings that survived. And there were probably many, many more women whose teachings were preserved, but libraries get burned and people die. And, so we've lost a lot of the memory of these women, unfortunately. That's why I worked so hard to scoop together whatever I could find that survived.
You say something on page 34. You said our Western and postmodern minds may find they're saying harsh, they exalt suffering and show a suspicious attitude toward the human body and reject the limits of sexuality. Why did you feel it important to note that how we view their words may be harsh to us in the West?
Because of that it can come across as if they're very suspicious of the human body. And the reality is that the goal was to become like the angels. And so many of our stories of the early women, they cropped their hair like guys, they put on the robes of guys, and they tried to live genderless, trying to become more like the angels. And today we understand, our human body is a gift from God. Our sexuality is a gift from God. Hopefully we are not going around wearing hair shirts and doing all sorts of unmentionable things we used to do in early and medieval times. I think living well is enough of an asceticism. But really their goal was purity of heart. Their goal was singular pursuit of God, which is partly why they left urban areas as much as they could, was to focus more intently on that one-on-one relationship with God, literally to become like fire, the passion of God, the power of God. Yeah.
That's helpful. Highlight for us some of the women that we should know from this time, and share a little bit of their stories from. I know you said some that you don't have a lot from, but those who you do.
Sure. I think a couple of my favorites is Olympias, who was a deacon in what is now Istanbul, then Constantinople. She had a monastery of 250 to 300 women. They went out and served the poor in their area. They were preaching, they were teaching. She was a major supporter of John Chrysostom, who was publicly condemning the corrupt lifestyle of the imperial family. So he got driven out of Constantinople, and she kept supporting him while he was on the run, both financially as well as, as a friend, emotionally and spiritually. She was actually one of the wealthiest women in the Roman Empire. She could be the equivalent of Melinda Gates, literally. And but she gave her money away responsibly. She didn't just, throw it to the wind. So she was very intentional about supporting orphans and widows, of establishing churches, of supporting missionaries in their work. So she's very careful about how she gave her wealth away, but she did. And she was a deaconess, so she's one of the first referred to in the specifically female gender. And so were 3 or 4 other women in her monastery, for sure we know, were also ordained deacons and seemed to have carried on a major ministry. And her main ministry seemed to be supporting John Chrysostom's teachings, condemning the corruption of the Roman Empire. I also love Maria, the harp player. Maria had been a liturgical musician in Jerusalem and eventually felt the call to to the desert. Again, that idea of going deep within and establishing a deep relationship with the divine. And so she moved out into the desert between Jerusalem and Jericho and moved into one of the caves there. And the histories talk about monks and people moving, walking from Jerusalem to Jericho, a major highway, and hearing her harp playing 7 times a day. They prayed the offices 7 times a day, which is the Psalms and portions of Scripture. And then all of a sudden they started realizing they weren't hearing her anymore after many years. And so an abbot of some small community sent 2 guys in to try to find her because they knew where her cave was. And they found that she had died. And so they wrapped her in her robes, dug a grave right within her cell, and buried her with her harp. And she had just been remembered very fondly in the church because of her harp playing and chanting way off in the desert. Sound carries really well in a desert, so she could have been 2 and 3 miles away, and they still would have heard her because the music would have bounced off the walls of the caves and the cliffs.
Mm-hmm. Those are helpful stories for us, I think, because we hear of like John Christendom. We don't think about the women that supported his ministry or how he wouldn't do ministry had it not been for the woman you named. One of the things I remember we talked about in the first conversation we had was the emphasis on prayer that the women had. And can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I think it really applies to us today as well. There was a tradition in the early church that the most important prayer were these at least morning and evening office. This was something that we inherited from the Jewish community. So it was praying psalms and scriptures and sitting quietly, reading some of the sacred texts or listening to it being heard, because you didn't actually read silently. In that time, even if you were all alone, you were still reading out loud. They didn't have that concept of silent reading. But what they teach for us is that prayer is not just something we do in the morning and the evening when we sit down to an intentional prayer time. They talk about cultivating a constant prayer, a constant awareness of God. So while they're working, they were all, unless they were independently wealthy, they were all self-supporting. And even the ones who were independently wealthy were. So they'd be, I know it can be a joke, but making baskets was actually, or weaving rope was actually considered a major economic endeavor back then. And they would be doing their work with their hands while reciting the entire Bible. They actually memorized it in the Hebrew and in the Greek, so that they can constantly remember God. And the idea was to grow within. I sometimes talk about the spiritual journey being, 3 feet long, but 5 miles deep. It's to go within and not look for something out. But they were also mindful of the poor. When they'd go into the villages to sell their wares and buy their supplies, the first 10% went to the local deacon to redistribute to the poor.
Mm-hmm. That's amazing. And I know we talked last time too about kind of the incarnational approach they had to ministry. And so we
literally being Christ to people. Yeah.
But and also showing that there was, there's obviously tension during this time with the with doctrine, and how the women kind of brought the balance of how to engage people in a way that kind of demonstrated what First Peter says in 3:5 with gentleness and respect. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, part of the reason we know some of these women is because of what that big term you and I learned in graduate school, Christological controversies. How could Jesus be fully human and fully divine? And that was not a Jewish problem. That was a Greek problem. The Greeks loved to split hairs on everything, and they thought they needed to understand it before they'd believe it. And the desert Ammas and Abbess would come into the village, and they basically preached in support of Athanasius's position that Jesus is fully human, fully divine. God is fully present in our world, and rejecting these other takes on, well, Jesus is, a superhuman, but not God, or Jesus is God, but he only appeared to be human. And so the incarnation, the fleshliness of God becoming human, was very, very important to them. And it was a way that they could relate to people who were not well educated. You got to you don't want to down talk to people, but you got to keep things real. And the incarnation for them was a way to talking about that was a way to keep Jesus real to the people who were considering becoming Christians or were being taught in their faith.
Mm-hmm. You talk about the prophetic voice of prophetic freedom in your book. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, the prophets have never died. You know that. Every generation has its group of prophets, and usually the ones that we don't like. We prefer our prophets dead, not alive. But we do. We're picking up from the Tanakh Old Testament. These desert ascetics really tried to help people understand that they could step away from the trappings of the Roman Empire and its culture, its politics, its death. So much dying, so much sickness in the Roman Empire, that people could step away from that and be a prophetic voice to the world. The prophet, as you probably know, is someone who gives voice to God's pain, anguish, and despair. And then at the same time, the Amas were saying, and this is how you make the journey away from that. And so they model for us today that call to be in the world, but not of the world, and to be a prophetic voice to the things that are going on around us.
Mm-hmm. That's helpful. What other things that you think we should know from your book that for our audience?
The call to simplicity, both and probably more interior rather than exterior, but exterior as well. That the Amas and Abbas call us to be really intentional about what we are about. That it's about faith, a relationship with Jesus, a relationship with one another as children of God. And it's not so much about institutional church and governance and power. I always tell my students, follow the power and follow the money. I think the Amas and Abbas again call us today to speak the truth to power. I think the Amas and Abbas again are calling us back to the fullness of our humanity, which is not about our stuff, our status, or whatever else, but who God has called us to be, who God created us to be. It doesn't matter what neighborhood you come from. It doesn't matter your education level. It doesn't matter who other people think you are. It's yourself before God, and to follow that call, to follow that lead. And people will do small things and big things, and we will touch people's lives in ways that we don't even know. Most of these Amas, there's absolutely no evidence that they thought anyone else other than their immediate followers would ever know that they had ever existed. But here they are speaking to us 2,000 years later. It was their call to simplicity that first attracted me, and it was the Desert Fathers I met first. And then I got a little angry because I knew there had to have been women out there, so that's when I went and pursued them. So don't buy into societal norms and listen to the prophets. Listen to the prophetic voices of today. And if they disturb you, that's really good. And the gospel should be disturbing us. If we pasteurize it and sanitize it, not good. Mm-hmm. There is a human tendency to do that, isn't there?
Yes, it is. Yeah. It is definitely. I didn't ask you at the beginning because I know people are probably listening. Can you define Amas and Abbas for people who have no reference point for that? Because I realize we're talking about it and we didn't define it early on.
Sure. Desert ascetics, these are people who left Roman society and went out to seek solitude and to step outside of the Roman Empire. Fairly quickly in Coptic, and the way we translate it into English is someone who is considered an elder in the spiritual journey, someone you look up to who has spent years intentionally seeking God, seeking wisdom. They get its honorific title is Amma for women and Abba for father, and it comes out of Coptic Egypt. And it's still the term that gets used in some of our lesser known Christian communities in the Middle East today. And from that, in the Western Christian tradition will come abbot and abbess. Mm-hmm. And the hope is that they are wise leaders.
And I love how you mentioned that the women would memorize the scriptures in Hebrew and Greek. It shows a robustness to their studies, that they were theologically savvy. just like the early church fathers. Can you speak to that? Because some people kind of think that women were illiterate during that, or were all illiterate during that time and just followed the men, but they could engage with the best of them.
Oh, absolutely. Jerome, the translator of the scripture into the Vulgate, which was a kind of Latin, he accredited several of the women, Marcella amongst them, as being really good sounding boards as he was working on his translations, that their command of Greek and Hebrew was just as strong as his. Women were literate, not all, of course, but we do have literate women, not only in Hebrew and Greek, but Latin. Women translated, but also copied manuscripts as a way of making a living, as well as to build their own library collection. And it wasn't just the Bible, which of course is our primary document, but histories and sermons, letters. They would copy those and send them on down the way. So they were also kind of a roving library, if you want to use that image. Literacy was a little bit different back then than we think of it today. You might be able to read, but you won't be able to write, or you may be able to copy a manuscript, but you won't understand what you're copying, because they were a much more oral culture than we are. East Africans are still, their brains are wired for oral. We've had Tanzanian sisters here going to school and they're back home, and if they heard an audiobook, they remembered it word for word. If they have to read the book, they slugged their way through because it was their third language. That they're telling us, scholars, that that's the way it was back then, that I would read out loud to you, let's say the book of Jeremiah, your brain would imprint that pretty quickly. But to pick up a manuscript and read it might be a totally different function for you. But Roman society, if you were, especially at the patrician class, generally women were well educated. What Christianity did is it freed a lot of women from the lower classes to go in pursuit of an education because they wanted to be able to read these texts for themselves. Mm-hmm. And we know from scholars tell us that women were actually the major force in growing the Christian movement after Jesus died. It was primarily a woman's movement.
Mm-hmm. So the women's movement didn't start in the early 20th century.
Yeah, never mind the suffragettes
rose from the dead.
Yeah,
that's a great way to look at it. For those who want to get in contact with you on social media, how can they do that?
I'm on Facebook, just Laura Swan, and my picture sort of looks like me. I think so. And I have an email address of lswan@stplacid.org. That's as much as I'm wired up. I don't own a cell phone, so I'm not wired up that way.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Sister Laura. This has been a great talk, and I encourage everybody to go get her book, The Forgotten Desert Mothers. It is a helpful resource. There's not many books written on early church mothers, so I think you definitely need this in your library, especially for not only women but for men. Everybody needs to read it. So we can know the women who undergirded the work to help push the gospel forward. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Lisa.